The Galactic Council looked into human eyes and saw the end. The ship was already shaking when I got the message. Not from turbulence, not from a malfunction. It was shaking because the docking arm of the tribunal station had locked onto my hull without asking permission, and the automated traction system was pulling me in whether I agreed to it or not. I had been flying for 11 days through empty space, alone, and the first thing the Galactic Council did when I arrived was grab my ship like I was a piece of luggage. I did not fight it. I sat back in my seat, finished the last of my coffee, cold, terrible, perfect, and watched through the viewport as the station grew large enough to block out the star behind it. Large is the wrong word. Large does not do it. The tribunal station was the size of a small moon. It had cloud formations inside its outer ring. I could see weather patterns through the observation panels on its upper hemisphere, slow white spirals drifting across a ceiling 3 kilometers above the main floor. Species had been born and died inside that station without ever seeing open space. It was not a building. It was a world that had decided to be a meeting room. My name is Kale Morrow. I am 44 years old, born in the city of Bristol on a planet called Earth, and I was the only human being within 40 light years in any direction. I was also, according to the official council filing, Defendant number 1 in the matter of species case 77 Alpha, commonly referred to among the council's administrative staff as the human problem. I had been given no legal team, no advisors, no support crew. Earth's diplomatic office had offered to send a delegation, and the council had responded by specifying that the summons was issued to a single representative and that additional personnel would be classified as an escalation. What they meant was, come alone so we can make this quiet. I came alone, but quiet was never something I was particularly good at. The docking bay was enormous and completely empty, except for 3 council attendants waiting at the bottom of the landing ramp. They were Veilthri, the oldest species on the council, tall and pale, with wide flat eyes that never seemed to fully close. They looked at me the way you look at a small animal that has wandered somewhere it clearly does not belong. One of them spoke. My translation implant, installed behind my left ear by Earth's Xenodiplomacy office, converted the sound into flat, polite English. Ambassador Morrow, you are late by 14 minutes. My ship was pulled in without my input, I said. If the council's docking arm can't manage the schedule, I'm happy to file a complaint. None of them responded to that. They simply turned and walked, expecting me to follow. I followed. I always follow when it suits me. The hallways of the tribunal station were built for species much larger than humans. The ceilings were 6 meters high. The corridors were wide enough to drive a transport vehicle through. Every surface was smooth and a pale shade of gray, lit from somewhere invisible, so that the light seemed to come from the walls themselves rather than any specific fixture. It was the kind of design that made you feel small without any single element being able to explain why. I had studied the council for most of my adult life. I had spent 8 years in the Xenodiplomacy office before being assigned as ambassador at large, which is a title that sounds impressive and means, in practical terms, that Earth sends you to places where normal diplomats are not welcome. I had read every translated council document available to humans. I had memorized the species profiles, the voting histories, the alliances and old grudges, and carefully maintained neutralities that held the council together. I knew these people, or I knew what they wanted other species to know about them. What I had not known, before this moment, was how it would feel to walk their halls and understand, bone deep, without any room for doubt, that they had never once considered the possibility that I might be studying them just as carefully as they had been studying us. 40 years ago, a council survey vessel had detected Earth's radio signals and diverted to investigate. First contact had been orderly, brief, and profoundly humbling for the human side. The council representatives had been patient, professional, and completely in control of every aspect of the encounter. They had explained the structure of galactic civilization. They had explained the accords that governed interstellar behavior. They had explained that Earth would be granted observed species status, which entitled humanity to exactly two things: the right to be aware that the Council existed, and the right to not be immediately classified as a hazard. Everything else, travel beyond our own solar system, contact with other species, colonization, resource extraction, military development, required Council approval. Applications took an average of 60 years to process. Humanity had listened politely, agreed to everything, signed the necessary documents, and then spent the next 4 decades doing precisely what humans have always done when someone tells them to wait. We did not wait. 7 colonies across 4 star systems, 3 frontier zones with active defensive installations, independent first contact with 12 pre-spaceflight species conducted without Council oversight, and a weapons development program that the Council had somehow learned about, which was particularly impressive given that we had not told anyone about it. That was why I was here, not because the Council was angry. Anger is simple. I was here because the Council was something much more complicated than angry, and I had begun to understand what that was before I had even left Earth. The attendants brought me to a long corridor lined with waiting rooms. Each door was marked with a symbol I did not need my implant to translate. I knew enough of the Council's formal script to read them: species name, case number, assigned slot. The door at the end of the corridor read, humans, case 77 Alpha, slot 1. Slot 1, first thing in the morning, before anyone else. I stood in front of that door for a moment and thought about what it meant to be a problem serious enough to go first. Then I went inside, sat down on a chair that was built for something taller than me, and waited. The room had no window. It had a single table, 2 chairs, a small pitcher of water that I assumed was safe to drink, and a panel on the far wall displaying a countdown to the start of the tribunal session. I had 4 hours. I used 2 of them to review my notes, 1 of them to sleep sitting up, and the last one to simply sit and be still, which is a skill nobody teaches you in diplomatic school, but which matters more than any language course ever written. When the attendant came to escort me to the tribunal chamber, I was ready. The chamber was, again, large is the wrong word. It was an architecture of authority. The ceiling was so far above that the upper sections were in soft shadow. The Council members sat in a curved arrangement of elevated platforms, each one slightly higher than the one before it, so that the person at the center, the lead counselor, sat at a height that required you to look up at a steep angle to meet their eyes. The speaker's platform, where I was expected to stand, was set in the lowest point of the room. It was a very elegant way to make someone feel small. 11 Council members, 11 species. I had seen their images, read their histories, studied their negotiating patterns. But reading about something and standing in a room with it are very different experiences. The one who caught my attention most was the Veil 3 elder at the far left of the curve. The attendants in the docking bay had been young by Veil 3 standards, meaning they were probably only 2 or 3 centuries old. This one was different. The stillness in it was not the stillness of waiting. It was the stillness of something that had been waiting for a very long time and had reached the far side of impatience, into a place where time moved differently. I walked to the speaker's platform. I stood straight. I looked up at the lead counselor, a chorus of moons representative, a species that existed as a synchronized collective, with the individual body before me functioning as a mouthpiece for a consciousness shared among thousands, and I waited for them to begin. The chorus of moons looked down at me with compound eyes that caught the light like cut glass. It spoke. My implant translated in real time. Species Representative Kale Morrow of Earth, you appear before this tribunal as sole respondent in case 77 Alpha. This tribunal is convened to assess humanity's violations of the Galactic Accord and determine appropriate remediation. Do you acknowledge the authority of this tribunal to render judgment? I had been coached by Earth's diplomatic office to say yes at this point. It was the standard response. It was the expected response. It was the response every species gave when they stood in this room. I looked up at the chorus of moons. I looked across the curved row of council members. I looked last at the Veil 3 elder at the far end, and the elder looked back at me. It had been still until that moment. But when our eyes met, something changed in its expression. It was very slight. Most people would not have noticed it. I noticed it. The elder had been alive for a very long time. It had seen species come before this tribunal in fear, in anger, in confusion, in desperate hope. It had probably seen every expression a living thing was capable of making when it stood in the lowest point of this room and looked up at power. It had not, I suspected, seen many of them look back the way I was looking. Yes, I said, I acknowledge the authority of this tribunal. I paused for exactly one breath. I'd also like to note for the record that I'm here voluntarily. My ship came equipped with a jump drive. I could have turned around at any point in the last 11 days. I didn't. That means something. I'd like the tribunal to keep that in mind. The chamber was very quiet. The Veil 3 elder, for the first time in what I would later learn was over a century of tribunal sessions, looked away first. I stood on my platform in the lowest point of the room and felt the weight of 11 species looking at me, and I thought about the word my grandmother had always used when people told her that things were impossible. She never argued with them. She just smiled and said, "We'll see." The tribunal session had not even officially begun. We had not yet reached the reading of charges. We had not yet heard a single accusation or a single piece of evidence. And somehow, without a single raised voice, the room had already shifted. I stood and waited for what came next. I had been standing on the speaker's platform for less than 3 minutes when the chorus of moons called the chamber to formal order, and the reading of charges began. It took 47 minutes. I stood through all of it without moving. I kept my hands still at my sides. I kept my breathing slow and even. I had learned a long time ago that the way you hold your body in a room tells people more than anything you say, and what I wanted this room to understand, without my saying it directly, was that nothing they were reading aloud surprised me, worried me, or moved me in any direction at all. Most of it was accurate. I will give the council that. Their intelligence on human activity was better than Earth's diplomatic office had assumed. The 7 colonies were correctly identified, with founding dates, population counts, and resource extraction figures that matched our own internal records almost exactly. The 3 frontier defensive zones were listed with the correct coordinates and a reasonably accurate assessment of their capabilities. The independent first contact events with 12 pre-spaceflight species were documented in detail, including 3 encounters that I had not personally known about, which told me that the Council had sources inside Earth's own exploratory program. That was a problem for another day. The charge that drew the longest reading was the weapons program. The Council called it a violation of the Accord of Stillness, which was the foundational agreement that governed military development among spacefaring species. Under the Accord, any new weapons system above a specific destructive threshold required Council review before deployment. The chorus of moons read the technical specifications of what our program had reportedly produced, and I will admit that hearing it listed aloud in a formal galactic tribunal, in a room with 11 alien species, by a collective consciousness that spoke with the resonance of 1,000 synchronized voices, was a genuinely strange experience. We had been building things, serious things, Things that, in the language of the Accord, represented a fundamental change in the balance of capability between humanity and every other species in the known galaxy. The chorus of moons finished the reading and looked down at me. The tribunal notes that the respondent has listened to the full enumeration of charges without response. Does the respondent wish to make a statement at this time? Not yet, I said. I'd like to ask a clarifying question first. A small ripple moved through the chamber. Council members shifted slightly. The chorus of moons paused in a way that suggested it was consulting with its broader collective before answering. Clarifying questions are permitted within procedural limits, it said. Proceed. How many of the species in this room, I said, filed formal notification with the Council before developing the technologies that made them spacefaring? The silence that followed was very precise. It was not the silence of confusion. It was the silence of a room full of very intelligent beings who had all immediately understood exactly where the question was going and were now deciding how to respond to it. The Scythii counselor spoke before the chorus of moons could answer. The Scythii were a young species by Council standards, barely 8,000 years into their spacefaring history, and their representative was correspondingly direct in a way that the older species had long since trained themselves not to be. That question is not relevant to the current proceedings, the Scythii said. The Accord of Stillness was established after the founding species achieved spaceflight, specifically to govern behavior once that threshold had been crossed. So the answer is 0, I said. Another silence. The Accord did not exist at that time, the chorus of moons said carefully. And yet here we are, I said, being judged under rules that were written after the fact, by species that never had to follow them when they were at the same stage of development we're at now. I let that sit for a moment. I just wanted to make sure we all understood the structure of what we're doing here. The Scythii counselor leaned forward. It was a young species, and its representative was correspondingly lean and quick, with a sharp, angular quality to its movements. Ambassador Morrow, this tribunal has not been convened to debate the history of the Accord. It has been convened because your species has demonstrated a consistent pattern of disregarding agreements that you signed voluntarily. We signed the Observed Species Agreement, I said. Yes, we did. Voluntarily, as you say. Would you like to know what we were told when we signed it? The Scythii did not answer. We were told that observed species status was the appropriate classification for a newly contacted civilization, and that advancement through the Council's tiered recognition system was a natural process that took time. We were told that applications for expanded rights were processed fairly and in the order received. I paused. Our first application for colony rights was filed 38 years ago. We have not received a response. Applications of that category require comprehensive assessment, the chorus of moons said. The timeline reflects the complexity of the process. 38 years, I said again calmly. For comparison, when the Tharnosi applied for colony rights, it took the Council 4 years to approve the application. I checked. The Tharnosi filed their application 6 months before ours. They had approved colonies before we received an acknowledgement that our application had been logged. The Tharnosi counselor, a broad, quiet being who had not spoken since the session began, very carefully looked at the table in front of it. I'm not making an accusation, I said, and I meant it. I'm explaining context. We applied through the proper channels. The proper channels did not function. People from my world were being born and dying on a single planet, knowing that there were other worlds available and that we were not permitted to go to them, while applications we had filed in good faith sat in a queue for 4 decades without movement. I would like the tribunal to consider what any species does when the systems they were told to trust stop functioning. They expand, I did not say. They protect themselves. They do the things that kept them alive for 200,000 years before any galactic council existed, because survival is not a policy position. It is a biological instruction written into every cell of every living thing that has ever had a reason to keep breathing. I did not say any of that. I did not need to. I could see it landing in the room anyway. In the small adjustments of posture and the careful stillness of eyes that did not want to react visibly. The SciFi counselor tried a different approach. Ambassador Morrow, the council recognizes that administrative delays may have been a contributing factor in your species' choices. However, the specific nature of your weapons program goes beyond simple colonization. The capabilities your program has developed represent a threat profile that— To who? I said. The SciFi stopped. A threat to who? I said again. Name the species that humanity has threatened. Name the incident. Name the council member who filed a complaint because a human vessel came into their territory uninvited, or because a human colony took resources from a claimed system, or because a human in any context, in 40 years of interstellar contact, directed violence or even the credible threat of violence toward any species in this room. I looked slowly across the curved row of platforms. I'll wait. The room was quiet. Our weapons program exists, I said, because we live in a galaxy we were given no meaningful way to navigate safely. We don't know what else is out there. The Council's own records document 17 distinct extinction-level events among spacefaring species in the past 50,000 years. You are aware of things we are not. You have seen things we haven't. And you gave us observed species status, which means you watch us but you are under no obligation to warn us. I paused. We built what we built because we couldn't afford not to. That is not aggression. That is the same calculation every species in this room made at some point in its history. The difference is that when you made it, nobody was watching. The SciFi counselor looked like it wanted to respond, but couldn't find the right point of entry. I pressed forward gently. The council called our behavior a pattern of disregard. I'd like to offer a different framing. We are a species that spent 200,000 years learning the hard way that survival requires preparation. We cannot turn that off because a treaty document tells us to. We're not built that way. No species is. You know that better than anyone. I looked at the chorus of moons directly. Your own founding documents describe the same logic. I read them. They're on file in the Council archive. The species that created the Accord of Stillness did so because they understood the danger of unchecked capability, which means they understood firsthand why capability gets built in the first place. From the far left of the curve, the Veil 3 Elder's voice arrived, quiet and very old, like something that had been stored for a long time and was now being carefully unsealed. Ambassador Morrow, it said. The entire chamber seemed to exhale slightly at the sound of its speaking. The other council members shifted. Even the chorus of moons deferred. When the Veil 3 Elder spoke in this room, everything else stopped. Do you know what you are? It said. It was not an insult. It was not rhetorical. It was a genuine question, asked with a directness and weight that made my translation implant seem almost inadequate to carry it. I looked at the elder. It was looking back at me with those wide, flat, never quite closed eyes, and the expression on its face was one I did not have a name for in any human language. It was not hostility. It was not curiosity. It was something older than both of those things. Survivors, I said. The elder held my gaze for a long time. Then it settled back slowly and looked at the table in front of it. Yes, it said very quietly, that is precisely the problem. The chamber did not break into noise after that. Council members did not confer visibly or make urgent gestures to their aides. The reaction was much smaller than that, and much harder to read. It was the reaction of a room full of very old, very experienced beings who had just heard something that confirmed a suspicion they had been carrying for a long time, and were not yet sure what to do about it. I stood on my platform in the lowest point of the room, and I did not feel small. The tribunal called a recess 4 minutes later. I was escorted back to my waiting room, given another pitcher of water, and left alone with a door that I was politely not told I could not open. I sat down. I thought about the Veil Three Elder's face when it had spoken. I thought about the word it had used. Problem. Not threat, not criminal, not enemy. Problem. There is a significant difference between being someone's enemy and being someone's problem. Enemies can be fought. Problems have to be solved. And to solve something, you have to understand it. You have to take it seriously. You have to look at it carefully enough to see what it actually is. They were finally starting to look. I drank the water. It tasted like nothing, which meant it had been processed to be safe for human consumption, which meant they had prepared for me specifically, which meant they had expected me to drink it rather than being escorted out in the first 10 minutes. Small things tell you everything. I leaned back in my chair and thought about what came next. I did not sleep that night. I told myself it was discipline, that I was using the hours to review strategy and prepare for the next session. That was true. But the fuller truth was that the waiting room felt different after dark, if dark was even the right word for a station that maintained artificial lighting on a 24-hour cycle regardless of any natural star's schedule. The lights had dimmed to a low amber. The hum of the station systems, which I had not consciously noticed during the day, was now the loudest sound in the room. And I was very aware, in the specific way you are aware of things at 3 in the morning when you are alone and far from home, that I was sitting inside a structure built by and for species that were not my own, in a room designed to hold me while people who held my future in their hands decided what to do with it. This was when the door opened. I was on my feet before I had consciously decided to move. Old habit, the kind you don't unlearn. The figure in the doorway was small by the standards of most species I had encountered here, which put it at roughly human height, which was one of the reasons I had not read much about the Tharnosi before this mission. They had never seemed especially relevant. They were a quiet species. They sat on the council but rarely spoke in formal session. They managed infrastructure, filed paperwork, and generally occupied the role of the people who kept everything running, while other species argued about what everything should be doing. This one was young, or at least it moved young, with the slightly too quick energy of someone who had not yet learned to be careful in every small motion. It looked at me, then at the corridor behind it, then back at me. Ambassador Morrow, it said. My implant translated the Tharnosi language into a voice that sounded like someone speaking through water, soft and slightly layered. My name is Vel. I am an administrative aide. I am not supposed to be here. I noticed, I said. What do you want? Vel stepped inside and pulled the door mostly closed behind it. I need you to understand something before tomorrow's session, something they are not going to tell you. I looked at Vel for a moment. I considered the possibility that this was a test, a council plan, designed to see how I responded to unsolicited information from an apparent ally. It was possible. It was also possible that I was looking at someone who was genuinely frightened and genuinely trying to help, because those two things were not mutually exclusive, and in my experience were often the same thing. Sit down, I said, and pulled the second chair around to face my own. Tell me. Vel sat. It placed both hands flat on the table in a gesture that my xenodiplomacy training told me was a Tharnosi signal of honesty, palms exposed, nothing held back. The hearing tomorrow is not about the charges, it said. The charges are real. The violations are real, but they are not why you were summoned. Then why was I summoned? Because the council has already decided, Vel said. The vote on Resolution 7 Omega is scheduled for the end of the formal hearing tomorrow. The deliberation period is procedural. It exists so the process appears fair. But the outcome was settled 3 weeks before you received the summons. I felt something go still inside me, not surprise, something more like the feeling of a hypothesis being confirmed that you had hoped to be wrong about. What is Resolution 7 Omega? Vel reached into the fold of its outer garment and produced a small data chip. Tharnosi standard format, compatible with my implant's reader by a considerable stroke of luck. Since the Tharnosi managed most of the Council's infrastructure systems and had built their hardware around interoperable standards, Vel set it on the table between us. This is the classified executive summary. I copied it this afternoon. If anyone asks, you found it through channels I cannot name and you do not know me. I looked at the chip, then at Vel. Why are you doing this? Vel's hand stayed flat on the table. Because what they intend to do is not fair, it said. And because the Tharnosi have a concept very old from before we joined the Council that says when you watch injustice happen and say nothing, you are no longer a witness. You are a participant. Vel paused. I have been a witness to many things in this station. I am tired of it. I picked up the chip and slotted it into my implant's reader port, behind my left ear, beside the translation unit. The data resolved into text that scrolled through a small display built into my contact lens. Another piece of Earth technology the Council did not know I was carrying, because we had stopped announcing what we were developing. Resolution 7 Omega, Executive Classification, Priority Sealed. Prepared for Council vote, Subject Case 77 Alpha Designation, Human Species. I read it in full. It took 11 minutes. Vel sat across from me and waited and did not speak. When I finished, I took the chip out and set it back on the table between us. The resolution proposed a reclassification of humanity from observed species to contained development subject. The language was careful and bureaucratic and constructed to sound reasonable. What it meant, stripped of the administrative phrasing, was this. Humanity's colonies would be placed under Council trusteeship. Our weapons program would be dismantled under Council supervision. Our expansion would be frozen at current limits, with any future growth requiring approval through a new review process with no defined timeline. Our defensive installations would be reduced to a level the Council determined appropriate for our stage of development. And all of it would be framed as protective measures for our own benefit. A species too young and too unpredictable to be trusted with the freedom they currently had. A cage, built with paperwork and called a gift. I looked at Vel. They expect us to agree to this. They expect you to not have a choice, Vel said. The vote is 11 members. They need 7 for a majority. As of this morning, they have 8 committed votes. And the other 3? Undecided or unwilling to be named either way before the formal session. Vel paused. One of the 8 committed votes is the Scythii. I thought you should know that. The Scythii, the young species, the one that had argued most sharply with me today, the one whose colonies had been approved in 4 years while ours sat in a queue for 38. I filed that away. There's something else in the summary, I said, the projection models. Vel did not look surprised that I had seen them. Yes. I had read them twice, because the first time I thought I had misunderstood the numbers. I had not. Buried in the technical appendix of Resolution 7 Omega, beneath the administrative language and the legal framework, was a set of internal council projections commissioned to model humanity's likely response to the resolution's enforcement. There were 6 distinct scenarios, ranging from immediate compliance to full military resistance. The Council's analysts had assigned probability values to each one. The probability of immediate compliance, 6%. The probability of diplomatic protest followed by eventual compliance, 11%. The probability of partial resistance and extended negotiation, 22%. The probability of full military resistance to enforcement, 55%. And at the bottom of the page, in a note that someone had evidently added, and then decided not to remove before the document was finalized. In all scenarios involving human military resistance, outcome is unmodeled due to insufficient data on human capability ceiling and behavioral limits under existential pressure. Unmodeled. In a document full of precise percentages and careful projections, the scenario that covered more than half the probability space had no predicted outcome. Not because the analysts were lazy, because they had run the numbers and the numbers had not given them a clear answer, and in 40,000 years of Galactic Council history, that had apparently never happened before. They know, I said. Yes, Vel said. They know that if they try to enforce this, they cannot predict what we do. The models say the probability of an outcome outside council precedent is 87% in the enforcement scenario, Vel said. In council history, that figure has never exceeded 12% for any species. The models are designed to be conservative. They understate uncertainty. I sat with that for a moment. 87% chance of something the council had never seen before, and they were still planning to vote. They're going ahead with it anyway, I said. Some of them believe the models are wrong, Vel said. Some of them believe that humanity will respond the way every other species has responded when faced with a unified council position, which is to say, with eventual compliance. They believe that your behavior so far is a performance, that underneath it you are frightened, and that frightened species comply. And what do you believe? I asked. Vel was quiet for a moment. I believe, it said slowly, that I have read your species' history files, all of them, not the summary the council prepared, the full archive including the sections that your own diplomatic office submitted when you first made contact. Vel paused. Humans are not frightened of the council. Humans are frightened of being trapped. Those are very different things, and the council's models do not account for the difference. I looked at Vel for a long time. What do you want from me? Nothing, Vel said. I want you to go into that chamber tomorrow and make them understand, not what you are. They know what you are. I want you to make them understand what happens if they do this wrong. Vel stood. Its hands came up from the table. The Tharnosi have been members of this council for 6,000 years. We have voted with the majority on every significant resolution in our entire membership. Tomorrow, we are one of the 8 committed votes for 7 Omega. Vel moved to the door. I will not tell you how I am going to vote, but I will tell you that I am paying very close attention to what you say in that chamber. Vel left. The door closed softly behind it. I sat in the amber-lit room for a long time after that. I thought about the projections. I thought about the 87%. I thought about what it meant that the council's own analysts, with all their data and all their models and all their 40,000 years of galactic history to draw on, had looked at humanity's behavior under existential pressure and written, in plain text, "We do not know." I thought about every generation of human beings that had looked at something impossible and said, "We do not know either, but let's find out." I opened a channel to Earth Command on the tightest, quietest beam frequency my ship's communications array could produce. I composed the message in my head twice before I sent it. I needed it to be clear without being long. I needed it to carry exactly the right amount of weight without tipping into anything that could be misread. I sent one word. Stand by. Then I closed the channel, put the data chip in my pocket, and spent the rest of the night preparing for the most important conversation in the history of my species. I walked into the tribunal chamber the next morning, and I looked different. Not in any way I could have named specifically. I had slept 2 hours and I was wearing the same clothes as the day before and my coffee had been cold again. But something had shifted, and the council members who were already in their places when I walked to the speaker's platform noticed it. I could see them noticing it. The small adjustments, the slightly more careful stillness. The chorus of moons called the session to order and announced that the formal hearing had reached the stage of respondents' closing statement, and that Ambassador Morrow would be permitted to address the tribunal for 1 standard hour. 1 hour, enough time if I used it correctly. I'd like to start with a question, I said. Not a procedural one this time, a real one. I'd like to ask every member of this tribunal to think about something that happened long before I was born." I paused. The chamber was quiet. The chorus of moons did not interrupt. "When your species was young," I said, "not the species you are now. With all your history and your council membership and your established place in the galaxy, when you were young and new to space, and trying to understand a universe that was much larger and more dangerous than anything your world had prepared you for, what kept you up at night?" The question landed in the room and settled there. I did not rush to fill the space after it. I had learned a long time ago that silence is not a gap to be filled. Sometimes silence is the point. "I'll tell you what kept us up at night," I said. "The Fermi paradox. Are you familiar with it? It was formulated by a physicist named Enrico Fermi on Earth in the middle of the 20th century before we had any contact with the wider galaxy. The question is simple. The universe is very old. Life, by the math, should be extremely common. Given enough time, some of that life should become intelligent, and some of that intelligent life should become spacefaring, and some of that spacefaring life should spread widely enough to be visible, audible, detectable in some way. And yet for most of our history, when we looked at the stars, we heard nothing. We saw nothing. We were alone, or appeared to be." I looked slowly across the curved row of platforms. "Why?" I watched the faces, or what served as faces for each species, and I watched the question arrive differently in each of them. The chorus of moons was unreadable as always. The Scythii representative's expression sharpened. The Tharnosi counselor, Vel's superior in some organizational sense, went very still. The Veil 3 elder looked at me without blinking, which was not unusual for it, but the quality of its attention changed. "We have answers now that we didn't have then," I said. "We know the galaxy is full of life. We know the council exists. We know there are species out there older than our civilization by factors we can barely calculate. So the silence makes even less sense than it did before, unless you accept one particular answer to the Fermi paradox that nobody in the diplomatic community likes to say directly." I stopped for a moment. "The universe is quiet because the species that make noise tend to stop making noise." A different kind of stillness moved through the chamber. "I have read the Council's historical archive," I said. "Not the public sections. The full archive, including the extinction records. I requested access under the Observed Species Information Rights Agreement, which, to your credit, the Council honored. I spent a long time with those records." I paused. "I counted. In the period your records cover, approximately 50,000 years, there have been 43 confirmed extinction events among spacefaring species. The Council classifies them under various headings: internal collapse, environmental catastrophe, resource conflict, biological event." I let my voice stay level and careful. "I noticed something. Of the 43 extinctions, 31 occurred to species that had recently reached a level of development roughly comparable to where humanity is right now. Newly spacefaring, early colony phase, beginning to develop serious technological capability. That is not a coincidence. That is a pattern." The room was absolutely quiet. "I am not making an accusation," I said, and I meant it, and I wanted them to hear that I meant it. "I am observing a pattern in data that you collected and that I was allowed to read. I am asking what it means. I am asking whether anyone in this room has asked what it means, and I am asking whether the answer to that question should affect what this tribunal decides to do today." I looked at the chorus of moons directly. "Because if there is something in this galaxy that removes young spacefaring species at a specific stage of development, and the Council is aware of it, and the Council's response to that knowledge was to create a system that keeps young species from developing the capability to defend themselves, then I think we need to have a very different conversation than the one we were having yesterday." The chorus of moons did not speak immediately. When it did, its voice was careful in a way it had not been careful before. "Ambassador Morrow, the extinction events in the Council's archive are the result of many factors. The Council does not." "I'm not asking what the Council does," I said quietly. I'm asking what the council knows. Another silence. We have a proposal to make, I said. An official one, filed with the tribunal as of this morning, under the observed species procedural rights that allow a respondent to submit formal documentation at any point during the hearing. I reached into my jacket pocket and removed a physical document, old-fashioned, paper, signed in ink, because some gestures matter more when they have weight and texture. I set it on the edge of the speaker's platform. Humanity is not here to apologize. We are here to negotiate. We are proposing full council membership for Earth with all the rights and responsibilities that entails. In exchange, we are offering a mutual defense treaty, a joint colonization framework with shared resource agreements, and full transparency on our current technological development, including the weapons program, under a review process that we designed together with equal input from both sides. I paused. We are not asking for permission. We are offering partnership. The SciFi counselor was on its feet. This is not a negotiation. This is a tribunal. The respondent does not make offers. The respondent answers charges. With respect, I said, the respondent is a species of 8 billion people with 7 established colonies, 3 defended frontier zones, and a weapons program your own analysts cannot put a ceiling on. The respondent is making an offer because the alternative is for your resolution to pass, for your enforcement mechanism to activate, and for the 87% scenario to play out in real time. I looked at the SciFi counselor steadily. I don't want that. I genuinely don't want that. I think this council has done more good for this galaxy than most of the species in it are capable of imagining. I think 40,000 years of relative stability is not an accident. I think you built something here that matters. I paused. And I think you are about to make a decision that will put all of it at risk, not because you are wicked, but because you are afraid. And I understand being afraid of us. I do, but I need you to understand something. I looked at each of them in turn. I took my time. The species that learned to be afraid of us and treated us like a threat in this room today, those species are not the ones that survived in the records I read. The species that treated creatures like us as partners rather than problems, those are the ones still here. I let that land. You are all still here, and I am asking you which history you want to be part of. The chamber was very quiet for a long time. The Veil 3 elder spoke last, as it always did, in a voice so low that the room had to go completely still to hear it. There was a species, it said, that stood in this chamber on that platform a very long time ago. They were young, they were capable, they were afraid not of us but of the universe, which is a different kind of fear and a more productive one. They made an argument very similar to the one you have made today. The elder paused. We listened to them. We brought them into the council. They helped us build what we are. Another pause, longer this time. They became the founding members of the Accord of Stillness, because they understood from the inside why capability must be paired with accountability. The elder looked at me. Do you understand what I am telling you? I looked back at it. You're telling me that the council was built by a species that started exactly where we are. I am telling you, the elder said slowly, that we have been hopping for 40 years that you would figure out how to say what you said today, and that several of us have been very afraid that you would not. I stood on the speaker's platform and felt the weight of that sentence settle over me like something physical. The vote on Resolution 7 Omega, the chorus of moons said, breaking the silence carefully, will proceed as scheduled at the close of this session. The tribunal will hear no further statements at this time. I nodded. I picked up my paper document from the edge of the platform. I stepped back. It was out of my hands now. It had always been going to be out of my hands at some point. I had said everything that needed to be said. I had not raised my voice. I had not made a direct threat. I had not lied, not once, not even in the places where a lie would have been easier. I stood on the speaker's platform, and I waited for the galaxy to decide. The vote was 6-5. Resolution 7 Omega failed by a single council member. The chorus of moons announced the result in its flat, resonant voice, and the chamber received it in silence. No celebration, no protest, a silence that had the quality of something enormous settling into a new position slowly, with great weight, permanently. I did not react visibly. I was very careful not to react visibly. This was not the moment for any expression that could be remembered and held against us. I stood on the speaker's platform, and I kept my face and my body exactly as they had been, and I breathed, and I waited. The Tharnosi counselor had changed its vote. Vel had not told me it would. Vel had not promised anything. Vel had only said it was paying attention. I would have liked, very much, to know exactly what it had heard. Humanity's counter-proposal was tabled for formal review. The Chorus of Moons announced that an intercession period of 90 standard days would be established, during which both parties would appoint negotiating representatives to develop a framework for discussion. It was not membership. It was not a treaty. It was an appointment to talk about possibly starting to talk about what things might look like if talking led somewhere. It was, by any reasonable measure, the smallest possible positive outcome. It was also, in the history of humanity's relationship with the Galactic Council, an absolute first. I was escorted out of the chamber and back through the vast corridors to the docking bay. I walked the same route I had walked when I arrived, past the same pale walls and the same enormous ceilings, and I was aware that the station felt different to me now. Not smaller, it was still incomprehensibly large. Not less alien, every surface and every sight was still the product of minds that had never grown up under the sky I had grown up under. But it felt less like something above me. It felt more like something beside me. I was almost to the docking bay when an attendant stopped me with a politely raised hand and delivered a message. The Veil 3 Elder requested a private meeting, if I was willing, before my departure. I was willing. The room where the Elder waited was small by tribunal station standards, which meant it was the size of a comfortable apartment. It had no table between us, no elevated platforms, no formal arrangement of any kind, just two chairs facing each other in a room where the light was warm and slightly golden, and where the hum of the station's systems was quieter than anywhere else I had been. The Elder was already seated when I arrived. I sat across from it, and for a moment we simply looked at each other. "You have questions," the Elder said. "About 100, I said, "but I suspect you asked me here to answer a specific one." The Elder made a sound that my translation implant rendered as something between an affirmation and a small, tired laugh. "I want to tell you what I saw," it said, "when you first arrived, in the docking bay, when I looked at you. I waited. I have sat in that tribunal chamber for longer than most civilizations have existed," the Elder said. "I have seen every kind of species come through that door. Frightened ones, angry ones, proud ones, broken ones. Ones that came in with great power and left diminished. Ones that came in with nothing and found something unexpected." The Elder paused. "The expression on your face when we made eye contact in the docking bay, before a word had been spoken, I have not seen that expression in a very long time." "What expression was it?" I asked. "Patience," the Elder said. "Not the patience of someone who has accepted their situation. The patience of someone who is waiting for the moment that is already coming and is comfortable with the wait because they have always been comfortable with waiting, because waiting has never once made them stop." The Elder paused. "I have seen that expression on 3 species in my lifetime. One of them went to war with the Council and was destroyed. One of them collapsed under its own internal pressures before the confrontation could arrive. And one of them," the Elder looked at me directly, "built the accord of stillness." I held that quietly for a moment. "You knew," I said. "You knew from the moment I arrived which way this was going to go." "I suspected," the Elder said. "I was not certain. Certainty is a thing you lose over a long enough lifetime. But I suspected." It paused. I also suspected that several of my colleagues were going to vote for 7 Omega out of fear and then spend the next several decades being grateful that it failed. Was one of those colleagues the Scythii? I asked. The elder made the small sound again. The Scythii are young, it said. They remember being afraid in a way the older species have forgotten. Fear makes young species reach for control. It is very understandable. It is also, in my experience, reliably counterproductive. They were one of the 8 committed votes, I said, but it ended up 6-5 against. That means at least 2 of the committed votes changed. Yes, the elder said, and did not explain further, and I did not push. I thought about Vel. I thought about a Tharnosi aide who had read our history files and decided that watching injustice happen was not the same as being neutral about it. I thought about the concept Vel had described, a word from their own language, from before the council, that said silence made you a participant. I thought about the fact that Vel's species had voted with the majority on every significant resolution in 6,000 years of council membership, and that this vote had ended 6-5, and that you only get to 6-5 if at least one of the 8 changes its mind. I would never know for certain. Vel had not told me, and I would not ask. Some things are better left as quiet certainties rather than confirmed facts. I need to ask you something, I said to the elder, about the extinction records. The elder was very still. The pattern, I said. The 31 extinctions at roughly our stage of development. I said in the chamber that I wasn't making an accusation. You were not, the elder said. I wasn't, I confirmed. But I am asking now privately whether what I said in the chamber was closer to the truth than anyone wanted to acknowledge publicly. The elder looked at me for a long time. Outside the warm-lit room, the station hummed. Somewhere in the vast upper reaches of the structure, clouds drifted across a manufactured sky. The universe, the elder said finally, is very old, and it is not empty, and not all of what it contains is part of the council, or sympathetic to the council's purposes, or interested in the survival of any particular collection of small warm-bodied species who recently learned to cross the space between stars. It paused. The accord of stillness was built to limit the kinds of capabilities that attract certain kinds of attention. This is not something we discuss in public session. I let that settle. And humanity, I said, with its weapons program and its frontier zones and its 7 colonies and its 87% probability of response outside council precedent, humanity is currently attracting a certain kind of attention. The elder said nothing, which was, in its way, a complete answer. I sat with the weight of that for a moment. Not fear, or not exactly fear. Something more like the feeling of a horizon expanding suddenly, when you come over a ridge and realize the landscape ahead is larger than anything on your map. The mutual defense treaty in our proposal, I said, that's not just about us and the council. No, the elder said simply, it is not. I nodded once, slowly. Then we have more to talk about than anyone in that chamber said today. Considerably more, the elder agreed. Which is why, Ambassador Morrow, it is very important that this negotiation succeeds, and why several of us were willing to risk a great deal to make sure it had the chance to start. I thought of the Tharnosi counselor and its changed vote. I thought of Vel in my room in the middle of the night with flat hands on the table and something old and tired in its eyes. I thought of the elder flinching just slightly in the docking bay and then looking away first in the chamber and then asking for this meeting. They had been working toward this too, not from the same side, not with the same methods, but toward the same outcome because they had seen what was coming and they had understood, long before today, that a species like humanity was not something you managed or contained. It was something you needed on your side. I want to know the elder's name, I said. You mentioned it existed, that you hadn't spoken it in a long time. The elder looked at me with those wide, flat eyes that never quite closed, and then slowly. It said a sound that my implant did not translate, not because it couldn't, but because names are not words. Names are specific, and this one had been held private for a very long time. Elean, the elder said. My name is Elean. Thank you, Elean, I said. Elean nodded, once, with a gravity that made the gesture feel like something much older and heavier than a simple acknowledgement. I left the station 40 minutes later. The docking arm released my ship without ceremony. The automated traction system did not grab me this time. I powered up my engines, cleared the station's traffic corridor, and pointed my nose toward the long, empty dark between here and home. I opened a channel to Earth Command. I composed the full report carefully and transmitted it on a secure beam, along with my recommendation. Accept the negotiation period. Appoint a full delegation, not a single representative. Bring people who are patient and thorough, and who do not need to win every exchange to feel secure in themselves. Bring people who understand that the conversation beginning now is not about today. It is about the next several centuries, and every generation that will live inside whatever we build. And this last part I added as a personal note, marked non-official, please send good coffee. The kind in the vacuum-sealed bags that keeps properly for a long journey. Because wherever this negotiation takes place, I suspect the local options are going to be adequate at best, and some things should not be compromised on. I sent the report. I sat back. I watched the tribunal station shrink in my rear viewport, that impossible artificial moon growing smaller and finally just another point of light among many. I thought about what Elean had said, about the universe being old and not empty and not entirely kind, about the kinds of attention that certain capabilities attracted, about the 31 extinctions in the records and the pattern that nobody discussed in public session, and the reason the Accord of Stillness had been written the way it had been written. Humanity had gone into this tribunal believing we were being judged for breaking rules. We were leaving with the understanding that the rules were only part of the story, and that the larger story was one the council had been carrying alone, quietly, for a very long time, and was now, cautiously, carefully, with the measured reluctance of people who had been disappointed before, beginning to share. I looked out at the stars. 200,000 years of human beings had looked at these same stars and tried to understand what they meant. Most of them had looked with wonder. Many of them had looked with longing. A handful of them, in the worst moments of human history, had looked with despair. I looked at them the way I always looked at them, the way that Elean had seen in the docking bay before a single word had passed between us. With patience, with the specific patience of someone who knows that the moment they have been working toward is already in motion, that it has been in motion for a long time, that all the waiting, all the planning, all the careful years of being small and dismissed and underestimated were not a period of loss. They were a period of preparation. The Galactic Council had looked into human eyes and seen the end. They had been right, it was the end. The end of a universe in which humanity was a footnote. The end of the era in which we could be ignored, studied from a safe distance, managed with paperwork and administrative delays, and the patient condescension of civilizations that had simply never met anything quite like us before. The end of our being a problem. I smiled at the stars, the way my grandmother had smiled at people who told her things were impossible. "We'll see," she used to say. "We'll see." I pointed my ship toward home and let the drive engage, and the stars stretched and blurred, and then I was moving, really moving, the way humans have always moved when someone tells them they cannot go any further. Forward.